So this is out of Phoenix. A Phoenix homeowner shot a man. This is just yesterday, folks. A Phoenix homeowner shot a man accused of breaking into his home early Thursday morning. The city's police department said officers were called to a home shortly before 1 a.m. where they found a man suffering from a serious but non-life-threatening gunshot wound. Investigators learned that he was shot after he entered into the house of the victim. Authorities said they believed the shooting was self-defense and did not arrest the homeowner. So neither the woman who was involved in the North Carolina car invasion shooting was arrested, and this homeowner was not arrested. This is pretty common not to be arrested in these defense of highly defensible property scenarios, folks, because it's so obvious that the fight came to you if you're dealing with an intruder into highly defensible property. That's very different than if these shootings had just happened out in a public street. Then you should absolutely expect arrest. And I would expect arrest even in the context of highly defensible property, but it's more common there that you'll see a non-arrest by the police of the shooter. So pretty straightforward facts here, right? Nothing very complicated. Phoenix homeowner, dude tries to break into his house at 1 a.m. and he shoots the person trying to break into his house. Apparently not very well, because the person trying to break in survived. But nevertheless, there we are. Pretty straightforward facts. So let's take a look at how Arizona treats defensive property. And again, I'll skip over the defense of personal property. This, again, is a state-specific course of instruction. This one for Arizona, of course. And Arizona applies their highly defensible property legal presumption to residential structures and occupied vehicles. And just like North Carolina, it creates a legal presumption that the defender had a reasonable fear of deadly force from the intruder, imminent deadly force, and a second presumption about the state of mind of the intruder, that the intruder intends deadly harm. So this is personal property. Let's skip over that. Let's get to, let's see. So Arizona is a little weird here. So first, they kind of discuss the use of force in defense of premises in one statute, 13-407. And really, in this statute, they don't give you anything special. In fact, the conditions that have to be met here to privilege the use of deadly force in defense of premises under 13-407 are the same conditions you need simply for deadly force self-defense, without the benefit of premises. So you're not really getting anything extra here. Don't worry, Arizona does give you extra privilege to use deadly force in the context of highly defensible property, but they do it a bit later in a different statute. But just for purposes of completeness, we can see here 13-407, justification, use of physical force in defense of premises. You're justified in threatening to use deadly force. So not using it, but threatening to use it, or threatening or using physical force, by which they mean non-deadly force, against another to prevent or terminate the commission or attempted commission of a criminal trespass. So not just a simple trespass, a trespass intended for criminal purposes. So you can threaten deadly force or threaten or use non-deadly force to prevent or terminate the commission or attempted commission of a criminal trespass. But you can't use deadly physical force except in defense of yourself or another person, as under the normal self-defense and defense of others laws. So you'd have to meet the normal 5 conditions of self-defense. Then there's a definition of premises: any real property, any structure, movable or immovable, permanent or temporary, adapted for both human residence and lodging, whether occupied or not. So then we get to statute 13-418, use of force in defense of residential structure or occupied vehicles. Notwithstanding any other provision of this chapter, a person is justified in threatening to use or using either non-deadly physical force or deadly physical force if they reasonably believe themselves or another person to be in imminent peril of death or serious physical injury. Well, so far they've given us nothing extra, because you're allowed to do that no matter where you are. That's just straight up self-defense. But it continues, and the person against whom the physical force was used was in the process of unlawfully or forcefully entering, or had unlawfully or forcibly entered a residential structure or occupied vehicle, or had removed or was attempting to remove another person, the kidnapping scenario. Now, two things to point out here. The first is, notice they don't say unlawfully and forcefully. They say unlawfully or forcefully. Now, here that doesn't matter so much because in the first part of this sentence, they already said it was justified. I mean, if you're justified under these conditions, that's just straight up self-defense. You don't really need the forcible entry anymore, because you'd be justified in using deadly force in self-defense regardless of being in premises. So this isn't giving you a lot more, but there's yet another statute. 13-419 starts with the word presumptions, and this is Arizona's legal presumption of reasonable fear statute, the equivalent to what we just read about North Carolina. It reads, a person is presumed to reasonably believe that the threat or use of physical force or deadly force is immediately necessary if the person knows or has reason to believe that the person against whom they're using the force unlawfully or forcefully entered, or has unlawfully or forcefully entered, and is present within the residential structure or occupied vehicle. Important here, or. Remember, North Carolina said and. Under North Carolina's legal presumption, you had to have both unlawful and forcible entry to remove the risk about shooting an innocent intruder. North Carolina did not want to give you the benefit of the legal presumption of reasonable fear of deadly force injury if you were facing an innocent intruder. You had to have both unlawful and forcible entry. But Arizona says, no, either one is okay. Either unlawful or forcible is enough. So a subtle difference, but an important difference. The details on this stuff matter, folks. The difference between and or here, between North Carolina and Arizona, is the difference between an acquittal or not being charged in the first place and the rest of your life in prison. So you might have heard me say in the past that use of force law is pretty much the same across the 50 states, about 80% the same. But that 20% variance can make a big difference, folks. I mean, the difference between no legal jeopardy and life in prison. So that was the legal presumption for the defender, that they had a reasonable belief that they were facing an imminent threat of deadly force harm. And then we have the legal presumption about the intruder state of mind. A person who is unlawfully or forcibly entering, or who has unlawfully or forcefully entered and is still present in a residential structure or occupied vehicle, is presumed to pose an imminent threat of unlawful deadly harm to any person who's in the residential structure or occupied vehicle. And then we have the exclusions under Arizona law, just like we saw in North Carolina. I believe they're exactly the same. So probably developed from the same model penal code in both states. Except this one does not have that final condition that North Carolina had, the fifth one, which was that they've already left. So they've discontinued efforts to get in. That's probably because they kind of covered that here, where they say is present in a residential. So if they're no longer present, if they've left, then you wouldn't get the benefit of this anyway. So the exclusions, let's see what else. And then we just have the jury instruction version. So right away, we can see the big difference between North Carolina and Arizona. They have very similar legal presumptions of reasonable fear by the defender, reasonable fear of imminent deadly force harm when dealing with an intruder in their home. But North Carolina requires the intrusion was both unlawful and forcible. And Arizona says either one of those is fine. You don't have to have both.